Right. So we would like to begin by acknowledging the Tasmanian Aboriginal people as the traditional and continuing custodians of this land, Lutruwita. We pay respect to the elders past and present who hold the memories, traditions, culture and knowledge of country. We extend our respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders peoples whose lands were never ceded. Now, I'm delighted to introduce Richard Tuffin for today's talk, Convicts in Space. Richard is a highly regarded archaeological researcher and the first recipient of the State Library of Tasmania's Research Fellowship. We're excited to be offering an expanded fellowship program for 2025. Further information will be available on the State Library's webpage soon. Now, Richard has always engaged extensively with our collections, and in bringing his expertise to this fellowship, his new research has shed light on an important and often misunderstood aspect of convict history. Using geographic information systems, he's located up to 90 probation stations, many of which have been lost to time. These stations significantly impacted the settlement of Van Diemen's Land, pushing settlement into even more remote parts of the island. Richard utilised the recently digitised series AG341, which is the Central Plan's Office survey diagrams, highlighting the value of this series for in-depth research. One of the joys of working at Libraries Tasmania is learning from the many scholars we welcome to the history room. And while I would love to say that, as Richard's fellowship contact, I've assisted him in this project, the truth is that Richard's expertise has made him a very independent researcher. And I know I'll learn a lot from his research, and I'm sure you will today. So now please join me in welcoming the State Library of Tasmania's Research Fellow for 2024, Richard Tuffin.
Yes. Wow, what an introduction. I don't need to talk about my project at all now. I feel like it's all been beautifully covered. So thank you, Liz. I am Richard Tuffin, also known as Dr. Richard Tuffin, and I am the recipient of the State Library Fellowship, which is quite the honour. And I'll say in the years following this, it'll only get better, I reckon, after what I've done. But what I'm going to talk to you today isn't so much about my research, which is what the fellowship is about, but more about what's underpinning my interest with the fellowship, which is the convict probation system. This sort of builds on a talk I gave back in 2021, which was about sort of the history of the convict probation system. And this sort of talks more about the landscape element, as well as reaching into what we're talking about with the National History Month about how to research these places as well. And I expect a lot of you are going to know what I'm talking about when I talk about how I research, but you're just going to have to bear with me because I'm a history fellowship winner and you have to do that. So, right, let's see if you're going to move. Clifford. So, it seems to have frozen, Clifford. It's all right. So I can do it the old-fashioned way.
Yeah.
That's all right. So for those who don't know, convict probation loosely dates to the period 1839 to 1853, with primary activity, of course, taking place in the 1840s. Very, very busy decade. It's linked at one end to the demise of what we know as the convict assignment system. Don't really need to introduce you guys to that. And at the other end, it's linked to the cessation of transportation in 1853. So two cool dates there. Now, when it was introduced in 1839, probation completely altered the governance of convict lives in the colony, as well as the incarcerative, disappointing, aren't I? And labour landscapes. That's okay. You can watch it online. So it completely changed the labour landscapes built by and for the convicts as well. The probation system, importantly, is also utterly unique to Van Diemen's Land because it's only in Van Diemen's Land, but also in Norfolk Island. So not utterly unique, but Norfolk Island from 1844 was administered from this colony. So let's say it was. It was born and developed in the colony of Van Diemen's Land. It defined the experience of thousands of men and women for 15 years and also completely redefined the relationship between the colony and the British masters as well. There we go. But despite the importance of probation to history, it was derided at the time and since as a monumental failure. It was portrayed as failing to afford the just measure of pain which they were after to the imprisoned masses. At the same time, it was apparently crushing the hapless colony under the monumental deadweight of a broken system. However, it's much more subtle than this. I'm an academic, so I love the subtleties of these things. So prior to probation's introduction, you've got the assignment system, as I said. So convicts, of course, are sent out to settlers. About 75% of those are under the settlers at any one time. And then you also have those convicts who are working in government service. So you have refractory convicts working in road gangs, chain gangs, and then also deeper down the rungs, you have the penal settlements as well. So there was therefore across the colony this loose network of camps and stations and barracks across all the settled areas, and then some punishment settlements a bit more further out, such as Macquarie Harbour and Port Arthur as well. Now, the assignment system was swept away by a rising tide of criticism at the time about supposed failure to be able to punish and reform convicts. And the demise of the assignment system was a complete foregone conclusion by the time the Molesworth Committee released its findings in 1838. And that damned the system, and that was known, as I said, the Molesworth Report, and that found that transportation to New South Wales should cease, which it did in 1840, and also that the crimes now punishable by transportation should in future be punished by confinement with hard labour at home or abroad. And that is the key finding of the Molesworth Report at that time, 1838, because that is what paves the way for the probation system. Now, that bit of that says at home, well, there were few penitentiaries in the British Isles at the time, so transportation had to continue. And with New South Wales out of the picture, all attention shifts to good old Van Diemen's Land. Now, the probation system that they implement is a really hard thing to define. I have to say that because I've built study around it. At its heart, there's this solid conceit that all the convicts were to receive the same measure of restraint and opportunity through sentence to a primary labour station. And this was all to be tempered with rigorous and uncompromising discipline, with moral and religious improvement all guiding them through their course. Separation, classification and rehabilitation were to be the watchwords of this system as well. However, with New South Wales closed to transportation, the system was not designed to cope with the influx of convicts that you see. And here's a really nice sort of demonstration of that, just a population graph showing what happens with the convict numbers post-assignment. And you just see the male population basically doubles in a few years, and it's just not built to cope with that. The colony and Britain worked out probation basically as it went along. So some of you who saw the talk in 2021 will have seen this animation before. I had to use it again. I'm so clever. Probation systems were basically stripped out with every boatload of correspondence that came through. You had sort of instructions on the system passing each other mid-transit. It was a complete and utter mess, basically. And initially, the way it started was with proposals to house all convicts on either Norfolk Island or the Tasman Peninsula. But that idea was quickly scrapped. And instead, probation became based upon the provision of a network of gangs and establishments across the colony to which all new transportees would be sent. And it's at these places that male convicts, and we're talking about male convicts here, would undergo a period of government service and then conditional release into the private service as pass holders. So basically a continuation of the old assignment system, even though they said they hated it. Now, the government-run establishments, all those primary labour stations, basically mirrored the earlier ones, those government-run establishments which had been under assignment. The difference being, of course, that all convicts who came through the colony post-1840 would be going through one of these government-run establishments. Now, the period 1840 to 46 is marked by a real struggle to build, staff and manage all these new stations that they need across the colony. And the situation really only improves in about 1846 to 48, when, as you can see here, you get a real drop-off in the convict population. And that is because they introduced the exile system at that time. And that meant they were transporting convicts who'd already spent some of their sentence in confinement in Britain. And when they came out, they actually came out as ticket of leave holders, which meant that the whole period of primary probation just was completely foregone. So all those stations became unnecessary in the end. So the prisoners who came out, we could say about post-1848, found a much better organised system, which began to really match those ideals of classification and reformation that they've been harping on about way back in the early 1840s. Yet by this time, the damage had really been done to probation, and probation was viewed as an abject failure. And after transportation cessation in 1853, the prisoners do continue to be incarcerated in a network of British administered stations, such as Port Arthur, and that was actually the last one which was handed over back to the colony in 1871. So you can almost say that probation lasts for a good few decades and finally finishes with the closure of Port Arthur in 71, but we use 1853 as a nice date for that. Now, the probation system I'm talking about here is very male-centric. It was initially designed for males and only applied to women after 1844. And that was as the result of the 1841 to 43 inquiry into female convict discipline. So from 1844, transported women faced probationary term in an establishment prior to their hiring out as a pass holder. They didn't face the gangs, though they still had separate and solitary confinement as well. And these primary establishments, you can see example there, which you all will know, were largely repurposed assignment era establishments. And the colony south, you've got the hub of the Cascades female factory, of course, and you've got the retrofitted ship the Anson, as well as a few shorter-lived branch establishments in Hobart, such as Liverpool Street. And you also have up further north, you've got Launceston and Ross. And they were the only primary establishments for women during the probation era. So only a few, with a lot more for the chaps. So let's get a bit more nitty-gritty about probation places and where they are and what they actually look like. So perhaps more so than during the preceding assignment era, the sites of physical incarceration and labour management were, of course, key to the management of this particular convict system. These were the carceral hubs that exposed convicts to the rigours and the restraints of penal incarceration prior to their staged release upon, getting the pass holder ticket. Now, the research I've done indicates that during probation, we have about a total of 106 stations in operation. Now, I use the term stations pretty loosely, but you can see here that station actually covers a whole raft of things, such as a probation station, penal station, chain gang, invalid depot, and outstations and that type of thing as well. So station covers a lot of things. And this map here is showing the distribution of those places there, which I'll talk a bit more about in a second. Now, of course, being the very confusing probation period, these places always seem to change their classification, or we're called the same thing at a different, or the different thing at the same time. So a probation station would often be called a hiring depot, which just makes things a bit more difficult than it should be. Now, this figure here also doesn't include the smaller aspects of the convict system, such as the public works, works parties or minor outstations. And if you include these, we get to about 150 places where convicts actually were incarcerated and were labouring across the colony in the 1840s. And the story of probation is told through these little places here, these little dots on the map. The changes that they all undergo is really key to understanding the system's implementation and its operation during those crucial years. Now, as I said, the arrival of so many convicts during such a short amount of time, you can just see spiking there, created an immediate infrastructure crisis in the colony. New stations were built, and more importantly, existing stations were retrofitted in existing areas of settlement. Or some of them were located in the system's untamed reaches, well, untamed inverted commas. Now, mapping that physical spread of probation, which you can do here through sort of some time-lapse mapping, you can see there's this real concentration of infrastructure early on along the main road of Launceston and Hobart. And that is because they're relying upon existing road gangs, which are situated there at the time, becomes a real hub for the convict population. And then you start to get further places being built off the communication tendrils as it's happening right there. They start to spread out east and west, and particularly dotted along the coast where you've got ease of access for supply as well. And then you can see after 1847, the outgrowth begins to retreat due to that centralisation of personnel and resources that takes place under the exile system coming into effect. So what we're looking at with today's remnant landscape, and you're someone who's interested in heritage, that's what I'm really interested in, is what these landscapes look like today. We're basically faced with a pretty difficult to read patchwork formed from a multitude of competing influences. So on the one hand, we have probation places governed by a mixture of colonial, British, and even private interests. And this map here is just a rough map showing you sort of who's in charge of what during 1848. Oh no, it's a moving map. Oh, I forgot that one. And that's just sort of showing basically who's paying the bills for these stations, because when you talk about the convict system, it's actually not homogenous who is actually funding money or putting money in. And prior to 1844, you've got a relatively harmonious relationship between the colony and Britain. There's little distinction being made between works which were of benefit to the colony and which were works of benefit to the home country. Works which were considered to be a benefit to the colony were basically infrastructure and land improvement, of which a large proportion of convicts were engaged. So roads, bridges, clearing land, all that type of thing. But what happens at the close of 1843 is good old Britain introduces a standing charge for convict labour, which for convicts who were deployed in works of benefit to the colony. And they were the ones who defined what those works actually were. And that was really ill-timed because in 1842, the colony had just entered a period of depression, which really, really strained its finances. So the colony had a really reduced ability to be able to pay for convict labour. This is a new charge, remember, as well, so they were a bit shocked about that. And their pleas of financial embarrassment fell on the deaf ears, with the Secretary of State, Lord Stanley, stating that local liability for local charges is the only valid security against the waste of public resources. I guess he had a point. So for its part, the colonial administrators began to really resent that convict labour was being sequestered away unattainable in these probation stations. A distinction began to be drawn between stations where the majority of convicts were employed for colonial benefit and those where convicts laboured largely for the benefit of the British Treasury. So at stations where the convict department, who represent the British Treasury, was in majority control, economy reigned supreme, economy and self-sufficiency. So places that the convict department ran were predominantly dedicated to the reception of all those convicts coming fresh off the transports, or were concerned about the punishment of recidivist convicts. And labour at these places were considered to have little benefit to the progression of the colony, instead was geared completely towards self-sufficiency and economy. And so we get some big stations, and one I'll hopefully show you a bit later on, are dedicated towards agriculture, huge agricultural stations, which is all about self-sufficiency and rations, which is a big, big expense for the convict department. But it's not doing a heck of a lot for the colony as a whole. In fact, it's using very important fertile land just to keep the convict system going. And the locals weren't too happy about that. Stations run by the convict department were generally in the unsettled districts, using available Crown land when it was available. So you've got places like Victoria Valley, which is just highlighted there. I should have shown a picture, but it's a map with a dot. You'll have to imagine it. That's in a relatively unsettled part of the colony at the time. And you've also got Fingor, which was situated up the northeast there. And they were both formed. They were two examples of stations which were formed with these strategies in mind of self-sufficiency through agriculture and land clearance as well. And of course, you've got the good old Tasman Peninsula, which becomes a real hub for convict department stations. You've got 6 new probation stations established, with existing stations like Port Arthur and the coal mines becoming ultra-penal establishments under the probation system. Interestingly, you've also got private enterprise takes a real hand in these places. So one of my favourites is Longmarsh Dam, which was ultimately a failed project between 1843 to 44. It was in part established using private subscription to dam the upper reaches of the Macquarie River to then help agriculture in the Midlands. Now, if you've been to this site, which is only accessible through 4-wheel drive, it's an incredible site. You've got a station up on a hill, and you can see sort of the state it's in. It's in very good state. And then below on the hill, on the course of the river, there's absolutely huge works that they've done just quarrying out the hillside to build the buttresses for this dam. It looks incredible. But I don't have any pictures of it, so you have to believe me. A bit more controversially than Longmarsh, which I have to say was a failed scheme in the end, You have a small mine down at Research Bay, which is a great little enterprise. And this was operated by a detached group of miners from the larger Tasman Peninsula coal mine. And that operated, as you can see, about 3 or so years. It was in part run by a private company, and it ended up costing the British government over £4,000 in rations and costs of superintendents. And it became known as the Southport Swindle, largely because quite a few of the officials in government actually had shares in this enterprise as well. So, yeah, nothing new there. Now, another key influence on the location of these probation places was the encouragement to free settlement. So Lieutenant Governor John Franklin, who you all know and love, wrote that convicts at stations would become the unwitting pioneers of the colony, improving transport and communication networks and clearing land in the unsettled district. And he's writing this sort of before things became a bit sour post-1844 with the British government. Now, these stations were initially managed by the Convict Department, and they were located towards the outer edges of the settled areas. So here you can see those deep green dots there are ones which were classified as unsettled districts, which depends on your point of view what settled and unsettled is, but that's what they classified as unsettled. And this is where a lot of the Convict Department stations were established. And these were meant to become vectors for programs of infrastructure and land improvement, and in part, especially early on, accelerate the colonial project. Yet, of course, post-1843, Britain's real obsession with economy saw convicts at these locations increasingly raising food just to keep themselves going. So that whole colonial project sort of just goes out the window. And these dream of their dream of self-sufficient agricultural establishments by the mid-1840s sort of dies a bit when some of these larger stations, Victoria Valley and later on Fingal, have to get relocated down the channel where the agriculture is kept on, but they're much more easily supplied by water. Victoria Valley in particular was quite a difficult station to keep in supply for the Convict Department, which of course costs them money, and they don't like that. But today's landscape does include a lot of examples where probation stations led to ongoing free settlement. So Fingal, I talked about before, was quite successful in the end. It operated up until 1848 and utilised labour of over 400 men to clear land, which was then bought up by private interests and became the town of Fingal today. And Deloraine, over there, in the Northern Midlands, I guess, no, probably a bit further than that, was operational until 47, and it was established to do roadworks and bridge works in the area and encourage settlement to the then frontiers further out to the west, and it was quite successful in that regard as well. And then, of course, Tasman Peninsula, which I mentioned before, at least 4 of those stations today are the hubs of townships as well. So probation really was a foundation for townships across the state. Now, the post-1847 rationalisation that I've mentioned before, so increasing the concentration in existing pockets in the settled and the unsettled districts. So this is just a, computer's trying to update. Don't do that. This is just a population graph just showing the bigger the dot, the more people are there. And what you can see is happening post-1847 is the convicts are all sort of being brought down into these particular hubs. And from 1847, when the Convict Department really begins to take over the management of these places, and that is on the back of the Latrobe's report, and he releases a really damning indictment of the probation system in 1847, basically saying it's utterly random. Whatever station you go to, you could get completely different treatment. And for a system that is meant to be sort of built upon classification and rightness of treatment for convicts, no matter where they were, it was a real indictment. So what happens then is the Convict Department says, okay, all right, we're taking over everything. And they then begin immediately a program of rationalisation. And you can see what happens is they begin to centralise back down in Hobart and up at Launceston, and particularly down on the Tasman Peninsula. And after transportation ceases, what happens is you get over 70% of the male convict population ends up being on the Tasman Peninsula. So that becomes a real hub at the time. Now, finally, we should also consider the type and the form of the places in which convicts were housed, of which, as I mentioned, there was a confusing array. So this is in part reflected in the various classifications that were incarcerated at these places, because you've got new arrivals, you've got assignment prisoners who are still circulating through the system, you've got all the recidivists who are there, pass holders, ticket of leave holders, invalids and the mentally ill. They all need to be catered for by these establishments. So this, of course, leads to great fluidity in the way in which probation places are classified. And that was noted by Latrobe in 1847 when he wrote, that which was a probation station today was turned into a punishment station or hiring depot tomorrow. So the system was just a bit of a mess. Now, when we're talking about a probation station, this is generally one which was erected post 1841 specifically to receive transportees. From the mid-1840s, stations then began to be further classified according to the type of prisoner that they held. So you have a number of stations in the settled districts, which were called hiring depots. And so they were basically places where convicts would be concentrated to be hired out as pass holders during their sort of post-primary incarceration phase. You also had depots established for invalids and the mentally ill as well. And you also have a number of stations classified as punishment stations, which were one step removed from places like Port Arthur and Norfolk Island, which were ultra penal stations as well. Now, at their most basic, convicts undergoing primary probation separated prisoners into three main classes. You've got hierarchical classes of third, you enter at third, and then through good behaviour, you go through second and then first. And what you can see here is there's actually different type of accommodation was meant to be built for the people depending on what your level was. So third class was meant to be held in separate accommodation, which is basically where they'd be held overnight when not working during the day. And then there would be associated accommodation, it was called, for first and second class. Basically, you work your way up to that. So it's places like these which form the basis for the whole fixation upon separate confinement. This is Pentonville over on the left, 1842, which was built in the British Isles. However, there's a real large gap between demanding ideals that look like this and actually implementing them on the ground, particularly in the colony of Van Diemen's Land. Now, we find separate cells really only being added to probation stations after a series of investigations in 1844 and 45 into the prevalence of homosexuality amongst the male convict population really scandalised the colonial administrators. So they got their butts into gear and they tried. Yeah. Whoops. They lost my train of thought. I think I'm blushing. Yes.
Homosexuality,
butts into gear. Right, they got their butts into gear and didn't build that. What they did was they tried to then do a whole program of separate cell construction across all of the remaining stations. But despite this, 1846, only 7 out of 25 probation stations had satisfactory number of cells being built, and the rest were either not completed or not even underway. So thinking about the people on the ground, they're caught between inadequate resourcing, because, of course, the colony is going through a depression and the British Treasury is really tightening its purse strings. And they are caught also between that increasing lack of cooperation between the colony and Britain. So the station administrators are required to implement their own interpretations. And here's an example of one of my favourite places, Cascades Probation Station down on the Tasman Peninsula. And as with many stations, Cascades had really rapid population growth. You can see over there, that's all in the space of a year or so that rise in population takes place. And we get up to about 450 men situated there, so a very busy establishment. And the infrastructure was very, very slow to catch up. And that's one of the hallmarks of these probation places, is you watch the population spike, and then a year or two later, you actually then watch the number of buildings increase. But by that time, the population begins to decrease again. So it's a really interesting, slow lag time with construction. So what we have here is a plan from 1842, and that shows what they wanted to build. And if you look at probation plans, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later, is you have to be very cautious, because often these are proposed probation plans, what they really want to do. And they'll often draw these amazing plans that look like Pentonville, and then there'll be a hut, and that's all they'll build. And here you can see with this Cascades plan, do I have a laser pointer? No, I don't have a laser pointer. You can see there's some grey buildings there. That is all that had been constructed. So they were just some buildings for the first class, so the good guys, and then you have a bakehouse and some offices accommodation being built. And all of these structures that were built of timber, slab and bark, because the fledgling years of these places, that is basically the only resources that they have to hand until they start to exploit stone and brick nearby. And you can see here, this is what the station looks like towards the end, and it doesn't really reflect that original plan that they had. So it expands away from the coast, reacting to the topography as it does so, because you can see either side you've got some deep ravines, so the station has to follow that southerly alignment. And new cells and quarters are added basically wherever they can fit. So places like Cascades are really indicative of that reactive nature of station building, which characterises so much of the 1840s. So these programs of retrofitting and lagging construction timelines take place across the colony as all these station administrators seek to apply quite vague dictates to the local landscape, or they're just very incompetent administrators, which some of them are. So as such, it's quite difficult to point to a particular probation era place as representing what we call the ideal station. Stations utilised existing assignment era infrastructure, which hampered new design, of course, or were faced completely by greenfield sites with no resourcing whatsoever. And it's only from 1846-47, with that rationalisation, that you see the wholesale implementation of the separate system in a more uniform adherence to probation's design aims. And this is just an example of that's a proposed plan over to the left. They love their radial designs because it could fit those separate cells beautifully. And then this is a plan of Victoria Valley, another cool probation site, and you can sort of see that does not look like the one on the left there. So they basically just had to build wherever they had space. So that's probation. That's the history stuff. Now, it being Family History Month, I thought I should talk to you a little bit about the ways we can sort of engage with these places, how to research, if you will. But I've seen so many of you about, I know you're all quite experienced researchers, so I really don't need to talk too much about this, but I will anyway because I've written it and I can't go off script. So the written records pertaining to the convict system are many, various, and all pretty much daunting. Now, I've been researching Tassie's convict past for about 25 years or so, and every time I start a research project, I do feel like I'm starting from scratch. So don't believe what Liz was saying about me not needing help. I always need help in many things. However, there's a few tips I can give that will make researching a convict place, whether it's probation period or not, a little bit less daunting. So yes, here's the start. This is the boring thing. You have to start somewhere. Check your local library and search away. You've got so many resources out there. A great tip I've found is searching the Tas archives just over there for general research notes. So talk to the people in the archives about what's there because they usually know what's there. Well, they always know what's there. And some really, really handy notes, which are only deposited in the last couple of years, are the records of John Thompson, who was an amateur archaeologist. He's passed away now, but he's left an amazing legacy where if a place isn't there in his collection, it probably doesn't exist. He collected a huge amount of material there. So it's a really, really good place to start is the records of John Thompson. And he's not just probation, he's other places outside of probation as well. So whether it be the local level history or something more expansive, odds are the place or places that you guys might be interested in have been mentioned somewhere. So that's me. So almost as obvious as that is engaging with other people, other researchers. So talk to your fellow researchers, particularly talk to the friendly archives and library staff, the nice person in the cafe, talk to everybody. And particularly if someone's written a book or a paper about something, get in contact with them. Because I know I love being contacted by people and asking questions. I'm not very good at replying, but I feel good when people write to me. So that's always something. And yeah, convicts, that's pretty much what I do. So getting into the weeds a little bit more, one of my favourite sources is this, the British Parliamentary Papers. So it's quite high level, but they provide a huge level of foundational information about what's going on in the convict system at the time. So people might condemn it as sort of high-level history, and yes, it is high-level history, but it's also foundational level history because you're understanding what they're trying to do. And the parliamentary papers are really, really good for that. And this is basically just the correspondence between the Secretary of State and the Colonial Secretary. But what it does is it contains a huge amount of attachments from other departments. So one of the best ones for the convict period, particularly probation, is the reports of the Comptroller General. That position was formed in 1843, and he provides voluminous reports from that time which appear in here. He talks about individual stations, and most importantly, for someone who loves statistics, is he provides huge amounts of stats about these places as well. So population stats, all those population figures I showed you before are drawn from things like this. So a great source. Now, of course, we can't forget CSO records, Colonial Secretary's Office records, correspondence held by the archives. Now, this record set, I'm sure you've all engaged with. It can be quite daunting. It's very helpful now that a number of the indexes are online, so you can actually search them through, I think, the names index. Yes, nodding from there. I'm glad I got that right. But the CSO period encompasses the convict period in full. And I always basically start with the British Parliamentary Papers and the CSO records, because what you can do with the indexes is you just have to think about the place you're interested in. So think about the place, think about people who are associated with it, think about events and departments as well, and just start to go through those index, get the reference, and then begin to look up the volumes as well. And there's huge amounts of stuff in the CSO. As I said, 25 years of researching, and I will never, ever expend what is in that for just to do with the convicts. Now, of course, we can't forget the con series. It's so important it's been inscribed on the UNESCO Memory of the World. Again, huge, daunting set of records. That's not for you to see. It's just to show you there's vast amounts, and that's not even all of it. But what you can do is, go online, look at the database, and begin to see what is there that might interest you to do with the place. But these particularly hold demographic records. So that is to do with, a lot of it is to do with the convicts that came through the system. Now, huge amounts of that, if not the vast majority, has now been transcribed and is available through Digital History Tasmania, which is run by Hamish Maxwell Stewart, which I'm loosely associated with. And that's a great way to start to engage with the people that are coming through these places. Now, as an archaeologist, I'm more interested in the places, and the people are just a byproduct of that. But even I can admit that, it's quite fun actually looking at the convict people that went through these places. I guess someone had to build the places I'm interested in. In similar fashion, we've got the records of the Comptroller General. So as I said, from 1843, he's plotting about running the convict system. So this covers the vital 1840s. So we have copies of this available here in the archives, and you also have, I hate to mention someone else, but we have the State Library of New South Wales also has the copies. In fact, they have the originals, which is weird. And the State Library has digitised them. Now, they're a really daunting record set to get to grips with, because currently there's no real good index for them. So you have to go to a year you're interested in and just plough your way through those records. Now, it's easier that it's online, and you can do that while sitting in front of some terrible TV show on Netflix. But I'm also working on an index. Hello, yes.
So
yes, the man, yes.
Royal Cub.
Yep.
And they're talking about linking the existing database and what's in there with other data that's been put together. Will that include perhaps some of your data?
Yes, I'm associated with that. Well, I don't need to speak as loud now. I'm associated with that project in some ways as well. A lot of this place location stuff I've been doing feeds into that as well. So for the Convict Memorial, when they start to expand it out and sort of look at getting people to move outside of the penitentiary landscape, my data on convict places and probation might feed into that as well. So my mapping will not go to waste as far as I'm aware. Should we keep questions until the end now, just in case?
Just because it's different from what's online as the Australian Joint Copying Project.
That's a tricky, not really, it's not a tricky question, Richard. The stuff available in that goes on to feed the British Parliamentary Papers. So that actually contains the original correspondence in handwritten form. And often you can find attachments and appendices that aren't published in the British Parliamentary Papers because they're all typeset. they'll actually appear in that there. So that I would have said is probably the best place to start. I didn't want to overcomplicate things, but that is often where I go. I'll look at the parliamentary published ones, but then I'll go to the originals, which are held in the Australian Joint Copying Handbook there. So I've probably all thoroughly confused you now.
And do you have like 20 minutes left?
I don't know anymore. I think so.
Okay,
Yeah.
I'm going to put some money in my.
Oh yeah. Okay. Yeah. Right. I won't wait for you.
Oh, no, don't.
I wasn't. So finally, not for the talk, but for this little section here, as regards correspondence, you've got the Lands and Surveys Department records. In particular, the correspondence series, LSD1. So you can see I'm a bit obsessed with correspondences, whether CSO, LSD, Comptroller General. This is accessible via an index, and it's quite a good index, like the CSO correspondence. And like the CSO, you can search for places and people. And it's a bit of a resource that people don't really think about when they're thinking about places, but it's incredible. And I recently looked at this for the fellowship with Liz, and that's some of the books I looked at up the top there. And the great thing about this is it talks a lot about, it's place focused. So it will actually tell you, I'm quite interested in how a convict station was established. Did they take over Crown land? Did they take over private land? And also what happened to it at the end? How does the station become, what it is today, which is often something in the ground? So who takes it over? And the LSD series often has correspondence to do with that. And it often has some nice maps. And there's a little example there of Lymington Probation Station. And that's a map from about 1852, which is just sketched off a larger map plan there. It's just been put into the LSD correspondence series. So very, very place focused. So during this sort of correspondence research, you might come across stuff like those maps, which are to do very much with the physicality of these past places. You might find stuff about the creation of a station, the layout of the buildings, and what happened to it when it closed. Sometimes, as I said, you might get lucky and find maps and plans, and that's a real buzz when you can find that type of stuff. However, there's some other resources you can really use to drill down into the place's physical history. So, of course, searching the archives database for maps and plans is an obvious way to start. Just type it into the index and see what pops up. And you'll find things to do with the Public Works Department there. So there's a lovely plan of, I think that's Rocky Hills Probation Station, which actually was built like that, one of the few. And then Liz mentioned the AG 341 series, which is what the core of my research is about at the moment. That's all beautifully digitized, and I'll talk about that a bit more specifically. And that's actually Jerusalem Probation Station there, sketched into a town lot. And then you've got some lovely things like these illustrations here. This is drawn from the CSO series, so scrunched in, well, not scrunched anymore, but and amongst the correspondence series, you have some elevations, plans. So these have all sort of been digitized and now available through the index as well, online and in high resolution. So we have town and county charts, and they're through the AG 341 series. And this is an example of one here, which is just up the Derwent, a place called Dromedary. And what we can do with these is drill down into really place-specific records. So you'll see there's often like a little fraction number there in the lot. And this one particularly says 792. So what that means, it's Monmouth, the area, book 7, and 92, which I think is leaf or folio or page or some archive term I don't know about. And what that does is then you look it up. Again, you can look it up online, and it brings up a plan of that lot. And if you know a station was there, these can be really, really cool because it might actually show some infrastructure to do with that. And in this case, this is from 1852, we find an annotation saying old station, partly cleared, and then a couple of huts down there. And that gives us pretty much a precise location for where this convict place was. Because before that, we mightn't have any idea about where it was, particularly if these places have been built over, which quite a few of them have. Now, another record which is quite like this is town charts and town plans as well. And they have sort of lots being broken up again. And you can see they will often have those fractional numbers there. In towns, they'll often have a slightly different number. There'll be an alpha before it. So in this case, you've got D1 over 9. And again, use the archives online, look at the index, chase that number. And what you can then do is find a plan which encompasses those lots. And in this particular case, this is up in Fingal. You've got You can see those little pink buildings there. And this is about in the 1890s, this plan has been done. And it shows some of those buildings which were left over from a probation station, which is pretty cool, but doesn't show a heck of a lot. But eagle-eyed researchers such as yourselves might notice at the top, there's some penciled things right there, which is A5/9 and A6/1. And if we look at that, this is from 1850. There's an earlier lot plan, and that shows the Fingal station in all its glory. It even shows fence lines, it shows gardens. And the great thing about that is I can put that over modern mapping through a process called georeferencing and show where these structures were within a metre or so of where they are in the landscape today. And of course, there's not much remaining of this station up in Fingal today. I think there's only one structure that remains from the probation period. But all this is archaeological. So in closing, we'll have a little chat, not a rant, about who really cares about these places and why we should care about probation places. Because probation is it's a white elephant on a colonial scale. Yet you've got to look at the scale of this system. It's a massively ambitious project that seeks to tie the colony and Britain together in ways that hasn't been done before. You've got sentences which are started in Britain, carried out on the ships, and then carried out in the colonies as well. It's meant to tie all this together. So it's a very important system. And it gives probation a real global perspective, a global significance, if you will. Though only implemented in Van Diemen's Land and Norfolk Island, it's a system that was integral to British strategy. And what's really interesting is that for an 8-year window, 40 to 48, Van Diemen's Land is the only place which is taking transportees in the British Empire at the time. So the focus is laser fixed upon our special little island. It becomes a bit of a laboratory for a penal experiment on a grand scale. So the convict system, and particularly probation, has formed a real deep impression on our physical and our cultural landscape today. So while it did follow established lines of settlement, such as up that main road that you can see there, that line of structures, the convict footprint was pushed out into completely new areas of the colony at the time. So whether they're improving land through clearance and enclosure, building the roads and the bridges, which are still there today, dams and causeways, or failing to build a dam if they're up in Longmarsh, or labouring in cells and workshops, these convicts all become unwilling agents of colonisation. Now, while many of these places did fail and were just reclaimed by the bush, as I pointed out, many did pave the way for future settlement as well. They formed the basis for towns which we know today. So in researching these places, in particular, looking at the extent of their footprint upon the Tassie landscape, we are shining a light on these places as well. And this recognition hopefully will one day lead to more adequate protections for these places, because sadly, a lot of these places, as I'll just show now, don't really have the protections, the heritage protections that one would assume for a system that I think is basically world significant. And speaking of world significant, four places in Tassie of about the 100 or so probation era ones that I've identified are listed on the World Heritage List, and they of course are Port Arthur, Coal Mines, Darlington, Cascades Female Factory, and only Darlington is listed for its association with the probation system. And at the state and the local level, you've got inclusion upon local planning schedules and statewide registers. Now, that does not guarantee that they are going to be shielded from unsuitable impacts, but what it does mean is that it does trigger investigations into these places. So if they're on a list somewhere, then someone, if a development's going to happen, will look at them. Now, currently the protections available under sort of local government schemes are patchy, to say the least. So some planning areas do have heritage schedules which identify places, and some have none whatsoever. It's completely random as to what is covered. And one of the real problems facing all of our lovely convict places is they're often really sprawling places. They comprise the wards and cells and the workshops that I talk about, but they also comprise big labour hinterlands. They comprise areas where the forestry was taking place, the quarrying, the roads and the bridges are all happening around these core areas. So single place listings, like a little dot on a map, can't do justice to these places. and it means that places will be lost to death by 1,000 cuts as all this unsuitable development can creep into the landscape. Now, one step above the local listings, we've got inclusion on the Tas Heritage Register, and this is administered by the Tas Heritage Council, and that makes a real difference if they're included on there. The register does have quite a few convict sites on it already, particularly from the convict period. So we've got about 51 places from the probation area which reside in the Tasmanian Heritage Register in one form or other. But if you remember back at the start of the talk, I said that there's about 106 places during probation which I've identified where you have stations operating. And of these, I know the location for 92 of them. So that means there's about 41 places which aren't included on the Tas Heritage Register in any shape or form. And that includes some really large and important places. So this is Victoria Valley here. And what you can see there is this is LiDAR imagery, which is basically shows terrain in very, very high detail. You can strip away vegetation and see the lumps and bumps. And for archaeologists who love all things to do with lumps and bumps, LiDAR is a fantastic tool to use. And so you can see here, those sort of indentations in the ground is where the Victoria Valley Station was. This is a plan which was done by Brett Noble and David Parham way back in '94. And when I overlaid it upon the LiDAR, perfect fit. Like, great archaeologists to be able to plan like that. And then this is the site today. You know, there's nothing there, which is good. Like, let's keep it that way. Let's not build anything on that. You've also got big stations like Nicole's Rivulet, 7 Mile Creek, and Lovely Banks probation stations. They all have some residues still standing above, but importantly also archaeological sites below ground, and they all have no level of protection whatsoever. Now, it's interesting looking at the places as they are listed. It's important to look at what the listing encompasses. So the hardworking guys at Tasmanian Heritage recently did a project where they actually started to, instead of having a dot on a map, they actually went through all the lot listings and started to show the areas which were protected under the THR, Tasmanian Heritage Register. So what we can see here is we've got Long Marsh Dam, and I mentioned there was a station on the Macquarie River, and that's that little dot up the top there, and you can sort of see it extends right down. That is because it's also encompassing the site of the dam, which was built there as well. So that's a pretty good coverage for the listing. And then you've got Browns River here, and that encompasses a large area of the station area, as well as some of the labour area that took place. But it's a bit moot at Browns River because it's had lots of housing built there over the last 20 years anyway. So I don't know how much of that is left archaeologically. Now, of those places which are listed, 15 only cover a small portion of where the known station exists. So this one's quite amusing. This is Westbury, where the big hiring depot was located. So you can see that purple over there. That's where some of the THR listings are. But then if you overlay the mapping, you actually find out that the core of the station hasn't really been included in any form or other of listing. So that's a little bit amusing. This is my favourite. This is Lymington Probation Station down the channel. You can see it's like they tried to avoid the station. So some of the outbuildings are covered, but the actual core of the station, and you can see the arrangement of the station there, that's in a paddock with no triggers for if a development occurs there. There's very little that seems to trigger further research into that place. So, you know, having that expand over that area would be quite important, I think, to further protection of these places. And as I said, very few of these listings take into account the complexities of these convict labour landscapes we're looking at. So I mentioned Cascades before. Some of you showed an interest in that. This is how the listing is for Cascades at the moment. The station core up the north there is covered. You know, it's quite. But what they've tried to do is then cover some of the landscape to the south, because Cascades has a hugely important timber getting landscape there. And all these dots you can see down the bottom, they are convict periods saw pits, and they are all still there in the landscape with log slides, a sawmill, and you can see that none of the listing encompasses that. So that sort of shows the complexity of some of these preserved landscapes which are facing us. So finally, you say, in conclusion, hopefully it's enlightened you a little bit about probation and, of course, the convict system's importance to Tasmania, but I really didn't need to tell you that. And hopefully some of the ways that you can engage with it. Also, sadly, I don't want to end on a bummer, but it does seem that we're a little bit away from actually having the protections that these places do really deserve. Now, hopefully you have a feeling for why these places are quite important, because of course, as I've said, thousands of men and women went through these places, and it shaped Tassie society for decades, and still does, I think. And elements of the probation system were transported elsewhere. So you get the hiring depots turning up in Western Australia. You get the use of gangs turning up in the Cape Colonies, to South Africa as well. And they're being exported by administrators who went through the probation system here and then move elsewhere in the British Empire as well. So it sets the template for ongoing systems of penal management elsewhere in the empire. And as has been shown, it had a really big impact upon the landscape of Tasmania as well. You've got all the townships and all the transport networks all being underpinned by all this convict labour. And of course, this perversely means that these places actually are a bit under threat as well. But yeah, don't want to end on a sad note at all. Like, as a fellow, I have to say it's a wonderful privilege to be able to research these things, and I would very happily answer any questions at all now or via email sort of about these places, because I love talking about them. And I think with the fellowship, I haven't really talked much about that, but the main output I want to do from this is taking all of those records that I found, I've shown you some of those plans and things and what I've been coming up with, and I'm putting them all into a GIS system, and then I'll be making that available through online mapping and interpretive tools that you can sort of look at these places, look at them on a map of Tasmania, go to them, see what some of the maps were, to link off to the archives resources as well. So sort of helping people understand the extent of probation in the state as well. So that'll be the main output from that when I get there. Yeah, so sorry that it went a bit over time from the looks of it.
It's just pretty good. And I think you can see what hard Richard is going to be with the research fellowship. Not only so knowledgeable, but it's so cool under pressure and great.
I had a good rest. It was good.
So, yeah, fantastic.
We had one question.
Oh, one question. Oh, yes, we have.
About someone was asking about any images that were associated with the probation station. I know you showed a lot of the plans.
Yes.
And then there's the list map that we can overlay. Anything else that we have?
To the stuff I'll be putting out will be sort of like that. And I've been involved in mapping projects before which show where these places were. So they're basically dots on map. So you can actually go through and see where these places were in Tasmania as well. So there are those resources, and of course all the stuff available online through the archives, all the maps and plans as well, and other repositories have some as well. So it's a bit of an unsatisfactory answer.
Over 80,000 records on AG 341 for everybody.
There you go. There's the numbers. Okay.